your podcast app. You'll see there's a discourse happening. Is this book a masterpiece or problematic? One's a lifelong diehard fan, the other's a first-time reader. Both are really smart and funny and attractive. Sweet feather, sweet feather, talking twins and hierarchy. Sweet feather, sweet feather, relentless focus on their body. Sweet feather, sweet feather, what do they mean by all American? Sweet feather, sweet feather, no sex, just titillation.
Hello, dear Pardo.
Dear Robert, hi. I did want to show you something.
Okay. What am I looking at? A miniature?
Describe to the listeners what you're seeing.
So I am seeing a tiny book called Dear Sister with the cover of Dear Sister on it.
The artist who made this is the wonderful Elliot Carroll.
Elliot Carroll made that?
Yeah, for my birthday, she gave it to me because she knew I was reading them. She asked me which one was my favorite, and I told her Dear Sister, and she made this for me.
Beautiful.
I'm almost at it. I'm so excited. You may remember that when we started, I said, okay, you have to stay at least till Dear Sister. And I said, if after Dear Sister, you're not interested in continuing this pursuit, I will let you
Free
go.
to go.
Do you understand why I said that?
I do. At some point, I want to talk about what I was expecting coming into this text and what I
Right.
got from this text, because they are very disparate. But yeah, I feel like this is a kind of text that grabs you in the middle of the night and does not let go.
The same way on the cover, Jessica's hands are sort of clutching onto this portrait of Elizabeth, and it's true. This story kind of clutches at one's mind, and for me certainly. And I'm gonna take some liberties and take an unvalidated hypothesis here, which is that I think for a lot of other people in the culture, this one is such a resonant one that sticks in people's memories. And this is one of the stories, and this is one of the books that, like, when you see that cover, it stirs the heart. It's just so powerful. So I just love this one.
Well, I'm glad to explore it with you. The book is titled Dear Sister. I know from Dangerous Love that Elizabeth is in a coma. I literally thought for the first 10 chapters of this book, Elizabeth was going to remain in the coma. And I thought because it's called Dear Sister, it called to mind this idea of like letter writing. And I thought it was going to be like Jessica sitting at the bedside, like clutching Elizabeth's hands, writing her letters, loving her back to life. And then she comes back to life at the end and she lives. And so imagine my surprise when very early on, Elizabeth wakes up from the coma and we've got a whole nother book on, baby.
And guess freaking what?
Yeah.
It's another one where what it's about is not even close to what it's about. And Francine and her merry troupe of geniuses who like to call themselves Kate William, Amy Boski, and one day I'm going to Google the name of the other ones, continue to keep us on our toes.
Oh my gosh.
Continue to just shatter our assumptions week after week. And that's including me already having read them a million times, okay? And I'm still being shattered.
Shall we to the plot summary? Elizabeth is in a coma and Jessica is seated beside her, praying for her speedy return to health. And Elizabeth comes out of the coma.
Everyone is excited about Elizabeth's speedy recovery. And yet, some start to perceive significant changes in Elizabeth's behavior and personality.
Elizabeth is acting recklessly and unconcerned about her schoolwork, her work at the Oracle, her relationship with Todd, her relationship with Jessica, her relationship with Enid. And so she is behaving as some would describe like deeply, deeply selfishly. And she is very interested in fun and fancy-free living.
Jessica begins to increasingly question, if Liz is Jess, then who am I? And it's described as an identity crisis in the book.
Meanwhile, Liz is going to all sorts of parties. She's flirting with all sorts of guys, notably Max, the drummer from the Droids. And brace yourself, listeners, Bruce Patman, 1 Bruce 1. She then has another date with Bruce Patman. Things get gross. We'll discuss that in a bit, but just as a level of plot summary, he is trying things with her that she is not interested in. Liz tries to get up from hanging out with Bruce and gets tangled in like the comforter or something, falls and bonks her head, and wakes up as the traditional Liz that we have known and loved for the last 6 books. Totally back to quote unquote normal. And that's the plot summary. It is nowhere near what I was expecting in any way, shape, or form, but how could these books ever be?
On the back, Dear Sister, a senseless tragedy, ...
No new information.
On the front, Dear Sister, can Jessica face life without Elizabeth?
Ooh. Well, that's rich, isn't it?
You know, one of the things that you talked about with Dangerous Love was that Dangerous Love very elegantly was able to hold and reflect the ambiguity of basically the cliffhanger of what's going to happen. So we talked about, is it the end of the road for Liz and Todd? Does it mean they break up, or does it mean there's an accident? If there's an accident, someone going to die? Like, what is this, right? In the same way, Dear Sister, both the title and the cover and a lot of the content is able to hold multiple readings. And so on the one hand, it encompasses the possibility that Elizabeth dies. On the cover, we have Jessica holding a framed, I think it's meant to be a black and white photo of Elizabeth. And that kind of, for me, conjures memorialization, or like this person may be deceased. However, we know Elizabeth actually lives. And yet this is still a book about memorialization. Jessica is still facing life without Elizabeth, meaning the old Liz. And then the other piece is, can Jessica face life? So one of the things we see on the cover is Jessica's looking at the viewer. So she's clutching the Elizabeth portrait, but her gaze is at the viewer. And I think we know she's always asking, how do you see me? How do you see me? And I think the question she's asking the viewer, and part of the questions of what does it mean for her to confront facing life without the old Liz, is, what do you see when you look at me if I don't have this foil? If I don't have the old Liz, the black and white, to provide such a contrast to me, what do you see when you look at me?
The clutching at once seems both loving and like determined or ferocious or unrelenting. Like there's this idea that on the one hand, she is clutching this photo saying like, I love this old Elizabeth. But on the other hand, there's this like ferocity and intensity to saying like, I'm going to cling to my vision of Elizabeth.
It's like, yeah, the black and whiteness of it and the framed of it, it's like, this is set in stone. Who this person was to me and how I thought of them has to say. What you said about the clutching and the different, I don't know, emotions or things that could convey, I think also really is, I have a lot on the title and the Dear Sister of it all, because I think like one of the things we noticed in book 5, All Night Long, there was a line that was like, Elizabeth feared that her dear sister was in over her adorable little head.
Yes.
And we talked then about how Dear Sister seemed ironic or seemed to encompass some tension or hostility. And I think that is 100% reflected in this title. So the first meaning of dear is the adjective, right? Like she's beloved. The second is this form of address, like writing a letter. And you talked about like, oh, I thought it was going to be like her writing letters to her while she's in a coma. But I thought that what is so interesting about thinking about like dear as a form of address, you would write a letter, is that it is a parallel to a coma, because it is asynchronous communication, right? Where you're writing to someone and you don't see their reaction. And so, right, when you're writing a letter and then you don't get to see them hear it and you don't get to see them respond to it immediately, right? And so that can be a way potentially to create a space for this sort of innermost thoughts. I was also thinking of the connotation of like dear diary, like it's letters, it's diaries, it's the confessing, it's the divulging. In sociolinguistics, forms of address is considered a very fruitful area for analysis because it shows the negotiation of interpersonal relationships and how those get socially constructed. This one person called R.R. Mehrotra had some article in International Journal of Sociology of Language. They said, address forms and represent a special aspect of relational language. They serve not merely as a bridge between individuals, but also as a kind of emotional capital, which can be invested and manipulated in order to achieve a specific result. And so I like this idea that dear can show all of these things. It can show the intimacy, it could show the warmth, it could show the closeness. But on the other hand, it could mean formality, politeness, distance, or ironic condescension. Like how Liz then uses it to her later in the book, right? Later in the book, Liz says, I know you, sister dear, when Jess wants to borrow the clothes. And she says, why not? And she goes, I know you, sister dear. And she says with a smile, but it's sarcastic, right?
We also similarly, the actual invocation of dear sister in the title, Lila is the one who says it. She says it to Jessica about Liz and basically says, like, you need to get your dear sister together because she's flirting and doing all this stuff.
Yes.
Lila is putting to the forefront this idea that we're using dear sarcastically here.
Yes, but it's also both. It's both.
Of course.
She is dear to her, right?
Of course.
Like Jessica, and it's not just because she does her chores. Like one of the huge themes that I freaking loved about this book was Jessica's development, and I'd love to hear your perspective. How she learns to understand empathy.
Yes.
But are we ready for that? Or
I don't have a huge note, but before we even begin with the text, did you clock the dedication?
Yes.
To Alexandra Guarnaschelli? Does that name ring a bell to you at all?
Oh, no. Who is it? Who is it?
So this is truly wild. Alex Guarnaschelli is an incredibly famous celebrity chef. She is all over Food Network. Today, to hoy en dia. Like, she is very famous right now. She hosts like several different shows. She's been on Iron Chef. She's been on Guy's Grocery Games. She is all over the Food Network. And at first I was like, what a strange coincidence. However, eagle-eyed readers will note there has been one previous dedication in the 7 books we've read. Do you remember it?
No.
Why would you? Book 1, Double Love, is dedicated to Maria Guarnaschelli. And according to Wikipedia, Maria is Alex's mom. So I really do think that these are the same people, that she is literally dedicating these books to Maria Guarnaschelli.
Food Network chef?
Well, so Maria, I think probably at the time, Maria was like in the publishing industry. And I think Alex was probably like closer to her same age contemporary Peter. So I assume this is dedicated as a friend, and maybe Maria is dedicated as a kind of mentor within the world of publishing. I don't know. But when I saw that name, I was like, oh, wow, what rich text to analyze. Just 3 short words, and we're already thinking about like chopping up vegetables.
And now I'm going to say back to you something that you said to me a few books ago, which is thank you for doing the work.
Oh, of course. We need to get into the text. Shall we to chapter 1?
We are back at SVH ICU.
This is like not even a note. It's just like the world's smallest note. But even when Elizabeth is in a coma, when she is at the toughest of her life, Jessica is dealing with as well, the narration still gives us this. Although Elizabeth and Jessica were identical twins, it was far from obvious now. Before the terrible motorcycle accident that had put Elizabeth in a coma, it was extremely difficult to tell the beautiful 16-year-old girls apart. When people in the sunny town of Sweet Valley, California saw a 5'6", gloriously attractive young girl with sun-streaked blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes, they knew it was one of the Wakefield twins, but they couldn't always be sure which one. Now, the difference was striking and heartbreaking to see. Elizabeth, once vibrant and lively, was frozen in pale, unmoving silence. She hardly resembled the vivacious girl she had been just a few days earlier. Jessica's fresh, youthful beauty was still very much in evidence, but it was marred by a worried expression, eyes red from crying, and a frown of pain and sorrow that seemed to have become permanent.
Yes, my note said the absolute chutzpah that literally paragraph 1 is she might be dead, and paragraph 2 is the impact of the coma on their appearance. I also noted how like Jessica's grief and pain is described so much just of how she looks, like look of misery, permanent frown, eyes red from crying. Can we talk about the first sentence for a sec?
Always, please. Elizabeth Wakefield lay still on the high, narrow hospital bed, as still as if she were dead, her twin sister Jessica thought.
This may be an overread.
Always.
But for me, the word lay still contains ambiguity in terms of agency. Are you lying still intentionally? Do you know what I'm saying? like so much of what this book is about for me, the neurological impact of her injury is left so ambiguous and so fuzzy. And a lot of the question is like, although it's not necessarily explicitly asked, how much is she in control of what she's doing?
Yes.
What does that mean? What does it even mean philosophically of like, if this is quote unquote her brain like, so when I saw the first line of her body lay like she lay still, I don't know, I thought there's something there of like, you're unconscious so you're not moving, but you can also like to lay still is also, how could you describe someone who's laying still intentionally? I don't know.
There's this moment where Jessica is seated by Elizabeth's bed. Lizzie, you know how much I love you, how much everybody loves you. They love you more than me. I love this idea that like the highest compliment, the highest form of flattery that Jessica can think of in her misery and sorrow is like, they love you even more than they love me, and they love me so much.
But that's actually real for her, right? Which is to say that, like, remember when she lost the football queen or whatever the hell it was she lost something to Elizabeth, and she was like, you did this because, or no, when she lost to Enid and Elizabeth's
Yes.
like, or whatever it was, she lost something to one of them and she was like, you rigged this because you're jealous I'm so more popular than you. And we know that that's what she goes to, popularity and like being liked and reputation and stuff. So for her to say like, everyone loves you more than me is a big sacrifice for her to say, you know?
I agree. As we keep moving, I think we're getting into a section that we might call the pervert police.
My writing became more unhinged, scrawling. It became larger and larger as the pages went on. Dr. John Edwards needs to be immediately apprehended.
Yeah. Take that license away.
Okay.
Not disbar. What's the thing where you're no longer a doctor anymore? Whatever that is.
Disboard. You know, they call them the boards. Maybe it's a board. Disboards said. I don't know, but he is a menace, and yikes.
Will you read
He's a fucking pervert. Yeah. A hand fell on Jessica's shoulder. Startled, she jerked her head up. Her blue-green eyes met a pair of soft brown ones in a kind face. Miss Wakefield? Yes. I could see the resemblance. You're both beautiful. Jessica regarded the man in his white lab coat, afraid of the news he might bring. I can only guess how painful it is for you to see your sister like this. I'm so worried. The man stooped so that his face was on a level with hers. Jessica, we're doing everything we can for Elizabeth. We're trying our best to make her well. Do you understand what I'm saying, you dumb fucking girl? She nodded mutely. Did he mean Elizabeth was going to be okay, or? My name is John Edwards. I'm the neurosurgeon on your sister's case. Dr. Edwards? That's right, Jessica. Your sister is in a coma. You know what that is, don't you? It means Liz is going to die. Jessica's voice cracked and the tears started again. She sobbed as if her heart were breaking. She felt strong hands on her shoulders, shaking her gently but insistently. Stop it, Jessica. Crying isn't going to help your sister. Elizabeth needs your strength, not your tears. Jessica raised a tear-stained face. You don't understand. I know how upset you are. You don't understand, Dr. Edwards, she said again. It's my fault, all my fault. Then she explains the motorcycle. Suddenly, Dr. Edwards' hands were cupping her face, forcing her to look up. Jessica, accidents happen. They aren't anyone's fault. Right now, blame isn't important. Guiding Elizabeth back to all of us is. That's what we have to do. You and your brother and your parents have to bring Elizabeth back. I'll help, Jessica, but it's really up to you. You have the best chance of reaching her. Just talk to her.
I feel like there are probably 6 different threads we want to pull out of that. Do you want to the most obvious one is like, hey, adult doctor, let's not tell a 16-year-old girl who is grieving that she is beautiful. Let's not touch her at all. It's a lot of forcible manipulation of Jessica's body. Cupping her face, pulling her hands up, making her look this way, making her look that way. Look like it is just truly, truly grotesque and icky.
And at the same time condescending. Like, it's also the talking to her like a child, stooping down to meet her face, saying, do you understand that? When he's actually being so vague and not giving her any information.
Yeah. And then thread 2, of course, is Dr. Edwards' tenuous understanding of the medical profession.
Yeah, it's like he's using The Secret as his method. It's really fucked up to put that burden on a 16-year-old girl, or to put that burden on anyone.
Definitely.
That whether someone's going to come out on a coma or not depends on whether they can do a good enough job talking them out of it, is a really fucked up thing to do to anyone. Unfortunately, that perspective is then reinforced by Alice, who tells Jess, again, she says, don't cry, which is
Oh,
already fucked up that John Edward said that. But then she also says, Elizabeth isn't going to die. We won't let her. You'll see, darling, she'll come out of this and everything will be the same as it was before the accident. So again, she's like guaranteeing something she cannot guarantee. Like, not only is she guaranteeing that Elizabeth's going to live, she's guaranteeing that everything's going to be the same. Which, if her brain got fucked enough to be in a coma, there's a very good chance that when she comes out of it, things are not going to be the same as she's lucky enough to live. Okay. Let alone, we won't let her. Again, putting the responsibility on themselves. It's this really pathological denial. And I did look it up. Typical rates of full recovery from coma after non-traumatic injuries, usually less than 10%. After whatever, the point is it's low. Okay. And like, does she have a fucking brain injury or not? Like, at no point do they actually say, like, we needed like one scene of Dr. John Edwards talking to the family and being like, okay, well, as I've explained to you in our many conversations previous to this, so you guys should all be understanding this by now. This thing, and I'm showing you an x-ray, this part of her brain got whatever. Now, based on her things, like, it should be okay. But what you might see, and you should look out for this and that. And sometimes this exhibits in that. And like, there was none of that. Now, one reading of that could be, Robert, that Elizabeth fucking faked the whole thing. There was no brain injury and she fully just made all. You know what I'm saying? No,
what?
Don't look at. Oh, I think that's a proper reading.
Wait, you think a proper reading is that Elizabeth is faking a coma?
No, not the coma. The personality change. Not
okay.
the like unawareness and forgetting related.
Great. Yes, that's a definite read.
No, I do not believe she faked a coma. No, John Edwards is a dummy. I don't think he's that much of a dummy that Elizabeth could just, no.
There's an interesting moment where where Jessica is talking to Elizabeth and she says, Liz, can you hear me? Please, Lizzie, it was my fault you got hurt. Well, maybe not all my fault, but I know you would never have let me down like that. I don't know how you do it. When you tell someone you're going to be somewhere, you're there. People can count on you. Only a jerk would count on me, Lizzie. I promise to be more responsible in the future, but I can't do it without you. You have to get well, Liz. I need you so much. That to me is so fascinating because even as everyone is trying to toxically and pathologically shift the blame onto Jessica, there is this moment where Jessica's like, well, it's actually not all my fault. Like, let's be real here. And then the line that really I found so interesting was, only a jerk would count on me. Jessica is grappling with her culpability or lack of culpability in this interaction. And I love that she's kind of saying, like, she's saying, it was kind of your fault for expecting me to pick you up in the first place when I was running around with boys. Only a jerk would count on me, which I think on some level in her grief, she means to be saying, like, I am so irresponsible that no one would ever count on me. But what she's actually saying is, like, you're a jerk for counting on me. You're an idiot. You share some of the blame.
Yeah. And I feel like they both really struggle in different and interesting ways in this book with culpability. The line I thought you were going to say that I was obsessed with on this page is when she's talking to Liz and saying, like, you always understand me, Liz. Nobody else does, not even me sometimes. I guess that's the big difference between us. You can get into other people's heads and then do things that make them feel better. That line felt so powerful to me because it really felt like, you know how we often observe the sort of moments where, like, they're dealing with adult situations, but they're using almost childish frames of reference. Or not childish frames of reference, but like you can see that they're sort of working through it. And so this feels like the beginning of Jessica's empathy journey, which is like the way Jessica describes empathy is you can get into other people's heads and do things to make them feel better. So like that's a capability. Like just the fact that Jessica articulates and sees that as a capability that she doesn't have is her sort of first step of engaging with empathy and sort of starting to attend to other people's feelings as sort of progresses through the book. And something about it felt realistic to me in the sense that, like, well, if someone really wasn't used to being empathetic, but they appreciate it in others and they're...
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So what we know about empathy is that it can be taught, that it is a skill like other things, that it requires conscious exercising before it becomes kind of unconscious and a natural process and part of your personality. And I do think this is, I mean, I highlighted this as well as like a really interesting way that we get into the psychology of a 16-year-old girl who has been up until now pretty self-absorbed and not very empathetic, This is like very believably how she would begin to engage with the world of other people's lives. Like she is doing perspective taking. We also, the other thing that I thought was really believable about her kind of psychology with this, Liz, answer me. How about if I say it was all my fault? Would that bring you back? I'll make a deal with you, Lizzie. I'll take all the blame and you'll live. What do you say? And like this idea that she's like trying to bargain feels very, very believable and realistic to me.
I observed something that stood out to me and made me say, huh? In Dangerous Love, I remember noticing that we didn't see the collision from Liz's perspective. Right? We saw Jessica arrives after, and then we see Todd's description of it. In this book is when we actually get Liz's perspective of it. And it's funny because she's in a coma, but we're getting almost her thinking or her memory of it or something. And it's like, and it says, then she made the decision, perhaps the worst of her life. She got on the bike. At first, nothing could have felt better than to ride behind the boy she loved as the motorcycle leaned into the curves of the road, the wind whipping through her hair. And she hadn't even seen the out-of-control van coming toward them until it was too late. She's supposedly unconscious, and this is when we're getting her interiority or something. Like, why? Because one of the questions I feel like I kept having throughout the book is, what does she remember? Because her avoidance of Todd and some of her attitudes toward the accident and what happened made me think like either she feels guilt that she was responsible and is telling herself a story that it was all Todd, or she like there's something going on with her own internal things about what happened. And this question of like, what does she remember happened, and what does she think happened, and what does she maybe not even sure about? But so the fact that like we get her interior memory, not necessarily memory, but it's described as what she was experiencing, makes me think, so she does remember.
I think we are being suggested that she has an understanding of at least the experience that she had. Like she can recollect it, I think.
But like what's sort of interesting in the book is like no one ever has that conversation of like, I'm not saying she needs to be lectured, but just there being some acknowledgement, even her own conflict of like, why did I do that? Like, it's one thing to get on the bike. I got on the bike without a helmet. It just seems like why? Like, that's crazy that I did that or whatever. And like, is it my fault? Or even talking about it in the house? Like, I don't know, it's just weird. That like everyone's sort of avoiding the facts of what happened, because the facts of what happens means Liz did something reckless.
And in some ways, perhaps, like we saw Jessica clinging to this image of Liz on the cover, and perhaps the whole family is clinging to, I mean, I do think the family is in denial about the ways that Elizabeth is acting.
In a way, Jess and Liz are both asking, who am I in this new world? So Jess is asking, who am I if Liz is me?
Right.
Liz is asking, like, I think assuming she wakes up from the coma and remembers what happened, she's now having to reconcile. She's confronted with what she did. She not only got on the bike, she got on the bike without a helmet. Old Liz wouldn't do that. Why there? And as we said with Dangerous Love, there was no reason for it. Todd wasn't pushing her. No. There was no jealousy thing. There was no, she sort of made that decision on her own for no good reason, right? And like Liz wouldn't do that. And as we know, Liz is extremely invested in changing things in her world to keep intact her image of good Liz. So remember someone called Robin Wilson, okay? Right. And so there may be something where Elizabeth's way of saying this is, Liz wouldn't do that. I guess I'm not Liz anymore.
Yeah.
I'm someone now who does do that. Who's my model for that? Jess. Guess what? I take risks all the time. I go on a bike again. I don't care about work because Liz isn't that. And so I think in some ways, her doing this just performance or just drag is a response to a lot of things. And maybe there's a lot of things going on there, but I think certainly one of them is her reckoning with her own choice to get on the bike. And what does that do to good Liz? Because there is no way to make sense of it. It's a senseless tragedy, as the book says, right? There is, the same way when she looked at Jess being manipulated by Bruce, she couldn't make sense of it. So she said, well, I guess he's a wizard. There is no way to make sense of her getting on that bike. Well, I guess she's not her anymore.
This to me brings up to mind counterphobia, which is when people have extreme fears, for example, letting go of control or, being unsafe. Sometimes they act in directly contradictory ways, like in perhaps like thrill-seeking ways. And I find it very kind of thought-provoking because what could be a simple soapy book about a girl waking up from a coma with a different personality is actually a much richer and complicated meditation on who are we, how do we understand ourselves, how are we in relation with other, how are we in relation with self. I do quickly just want to highlight creepy Dr. Edwards comes back and overhears.
Ruffles her hair.
He basically says, I hear you talking to Elizabeth. You are talking like I was hoping that you would be talking to her about everyday things. Don't lay your guilt on her. Well, then where am I supposed to put it, Dr. Dreamy? Because like my life is effed. Talk about family, school, boys, whatever. Just chat as if you expect her to understand an answer. That is like terrible and stupid advice. But what really, really makes me laugh is the way Jessica takes that ball and runs with it. So what she starts saying is, remember the time I tried to take Todd away from you? And like she recounts that. Take Enid Rollins, for example. She's world-class dull, for heaven's sakes, but she's your friend, so you always stick up for her. When I blabbed her secret to everyone, you were right there defending her. Now I'm sorry for the way I acted, Liz, and I promise I'll never make another crack about Enid ever. Do you mind if I say something about your makeup, Liz? Don't get me wrong, you always look good, but with more eye makeup and blusher, you could be sensational. And your clothes. Jeans and button-down shirts are okay, but sometimes you're too conservative. When you get out of here, we've got to go shopping. I'll help you pick out some really spectacular outfits, okay? This is her idea of like everyday chats, recounting the ways that she has backstabbed her and then offering her unsolicited advice on her physical appearance. I think that is truly, truly, truly hilarious. I like a world in which Elizabeth is actually laying still, as you said, and alert and can hear. Because if you think about it, she says, you'd always be there for Enid. You're always the one for Todd. You should change your makeup and hair. You should change your clothes.
Well, that's the thing. She probably can actually hear her, right?
Right?
It's not that she was faking the whole coma, but I think in this scene, she's faking it because Jessica's making all these promises and she wakes up and says, let me take you up on it, bitch.
And then she also, I did not realize this Pascal's gun in the moment, but upon reflection, I do realize it. You're still the star reporter of the Oracle. No one else could write the eyes and ears column as well as you do. You always manage to keep it light and funny. You know, Liz, I bet it's probably the only gossip column in the world people actually want to be in. You never make anyone look bad. I mean, that obviously foreshadows later when Elizabeth uses the eyes and ears column to sabotage a relationship. But it's just so funny that in this first chapter, it's hilarious, it's witty, it's silly, and it also contains kind of, as we said, as Dr. Whalen said, like the engine for this whole book. Like it gives us a blueprint for how Elizabeth is going to act, what she's going to do, who she's going to turn her back on. It's very interesting to me.
Yeah, like something that supports that Liz is sort of reacting is that so much of what Jessica's saying is like, this is who you are. I'm telling you right now who you are. You are good and kind. You never let people down. You're always good to others. You put other and so that is not consistent. Like you are responsible. You're smart. You don't fuck up. Is not consistent with the choice that she made.
Right.
So being told that you're this good and perfect person, knowing that you did that thing, is creating a tension for Elizabeth. And the way she's deciding to resolve it is by going to an extreme. Right. It's not by her trying to reconcile and say, well, wow, I am flawed and there was something going on there and I wonder why I made that choice and maybe it's not that simple or whatever, right? Yeah.
Chapter 1 ends, a soft moan came from the still figure on the bed. Liz? Jessica burst out into the corridor. Mom, Dad, Dr. Edwards, somebody, she's awake. Dr. Edwards comes in and with a smile says, I think your daughter has decided to come back to us. Liz wakes up. At the end of chapter 1, she's out of this coma. What is Elizabeth's first word out of the coma, Pardo?
Thank you. Her first word is Jessica.
Nothing to be made of there. We'll just keep moving, I guess.
All right. So a lot of this book is about social identities and identity and social roles. A lot of this book has to do with people telling Liz who she is and her deciding when and where she says, yes, I am that. Yes, that's me. Or no, it is not. And a lot of this book is Jessica saying, Liz, you there? Liz, is that you? Liz, can you hear me? And there's scenes and scenes and scenes, or her saying, Elizabeth Wakefield, get there, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth doesn't, almost never until the very end of the book, does Elizabeth actually respond and say, yes, that's me. She always either ignores it or responds with something else. And this is our first example of that. Jessica's been talking to her in the coma, Liz, Lizzie, Liz, Lizzie. Liz, can you hear us? And when Liz wakes up, she doesn't say, yes, I hear you. She says, Jessica. And so not only is she not responding to Liz, she's saying the word Jessica, which could be interpreted as her addressing the person in front of her.
Could you imagine?
Or is she saying, Jessica is who I am now?
I've woken up out of my coma. I am Jessica. Can we talk about when Elizabeth says her first this is the first beyond just the word Jessica. So she's sobbing. No, don't call anybody. I don't want anybody to see me, Jess. Look at me. Just look at me. She's crying. Jessica says, why are you crying? Wouldn't you cry if you looked like me? If I looked like you? Liz, I do look like you. We're twins, remember? Of course I remember. What are you trying to tell me, Jess? Are you saying I'm stupid or maybe crazy because I got hit in the head?
Yeah, so much here. Number one, the inversion of book one, which started with, oh, Lizzie, it looks so horrendous today, but she didn't have an inch of fat anywhere. So here we have Elizabeth doing the dramatics. I look terrible and basically pay attention to me in that way. One thing's kind of interesting is the line, Jessica wished somebody else were there to handle this. And I think like increasingly over the book, you see her become like she sort of has a meltdown, right? And in the end, she gets in this fender bender because she's so drained and stressed out from having to manage Elizabeth. And it's this, I think that also kind of makes an impact on her empathy, right?
And the line, Jessica wished somebody else were there to handle this. Why aren't there other people there to handle this? She has a mom and a dad. She should have a trained team of medical professionals there to kind of touch her inappropriately and nurse her back to health. Like, why is Jessica the one there dealing with all of this?
Yeah, and that's her way of, I think, realizing like there's something above my pay grade going on here.
Yes.
And there's a really heartbreaking moment, I thought, when she finally goes to seek guidance from Mr. Collins, and he, I don't know, is sympathetic or validating in some way, and it says finally she felt like she had an adult ally. That line was soul crushing because it's like her parents are not there. Like the doctor certainly wasn't helpful. Her parents are not paying attention. She doesn't have adult allies. It's sad. It's
really sad. There's also this really interesting, she says, I don't want anybody to see me, Jess, she cried. Jessica sat in the chair. What do you mean? And then Elizabeth takes her hands away from her face and sat up. Look at me, just look at me, which is such an interesting kind of contradiction. I don't want anybody to see me. Look at me, look at me. It in some ways foreshadows the way that she treats Jess for the rest of the novel, as if Jess is not a person. I don't want anybody to look at me. I don't want anyone important. I don't want anyone real. But you can look at me, Jess, because you don't matter. Part of Jessica thought this was strange, that Elizabeth was actually worried about her looks. But another part was overjoyed. And of course, she was relieved when she realized her sister's tears didn't mean she was having some sort of relapse. Worrying about looks was something Jessica could easily understand.
Jessica says Todd's going to come by. Elizabeth reacts like, Todd is coming here. Elizabeth shrank back against the pillows. Having turned away, Jessica missed the look of panic that flitted across her sister's face. That line seemed really important to me because that's Elizabeth having an expression that is not a performance because Jessica doesn't see it. She's turned away. So that panic is real. And that's what was one of the signals to me of starting to wonder about what's going on with Elizabeth with respect to how she feels about what happened.
What my slight confusion is what, and I think it's kind of left ambiguous. What is that panic?
I think it has to do with welcoming Todd back in would entail confronting what happened. Like by cutting him out, she's not really having that conversation with anyone. She doesn't have to be constantly reminded of it. So I think that in the sense, both of it was traumatic for her maybe. And yeah, she's trying to do this, but also in the sense of confronting the fact that she did something that she may not be ready to acknowledge.
I love this. I think it's just such an interesting, rich text. Jessica has brought Liz clothes, but Liz is upset that Jessica didn't bring anything sexier. So then I feel bad for Todd because he's talking to Jessica and he says, it almost seemed like she was bored, like she couldn't wait for me to leave. And then Jessica says, guys are really something. Liz just came out of a coma and you expect to be laughing and smiling as if nothing happened. Just then, the sound of Elizabeth's laughter floated out to the hall. Yeah, Jess, and then again, maybe doctors are more interesting than basketball players. Todd strode over to the elevator and punched the down button. Jessica tiptoed to the door of Elizabeth's room and peeked in. Elizabeth looked anything but tired. Not only was she sitting up, she was smiling at Dr. Edwards. If she hadn't known that Elizabeth wasn't the flirting type, Jessica would have sworn her sister was making a play for the doctor.
Yeah, like one of the things I think is interesting about Todd and Jessica's relationship in this one is like the way she responds defensively to him when he points out what she is seeing but not ready to yet admit. Even from this moment, this is the probably the first time, right? Where he shows up, Liz says she's tired. You know, Todd's like, okay, but he's sort of disappointed, and Jessica's like, well, don't be selfish. Of course she's tired. She just came out of coma, right? And that happens like continuously through the book, where later he says like, have you noticed she's changed? And she's like, what are you talking about? She hasn't changed. She's exactly the same. And it's like, well, why? I think because it's like there's a denial there, or there's a whatever. And so but just the development of their two of them's bond, I think, through the book. For some reason, I'm invested in Jessica and Todd's bond. I like it when they have moments of being on the same side of things or connecting. And so I just enjoyed watching that sort of develop in their alienation from Liz.
It gets really, really interesting as like one reading, I guess, is Jessica kind of like, I mean, not to throw this word around, but like Jessica kind of gaslights Todd throughout the whole book. Basically, throughout the whole book, Jessica's like, Elizabeth's totally fine, Todd. You are being a monster for expecting anything different. Like the things you're noticing are wrong.
I
don't think it's really gaslighting. I think it's more about Jessica's psychology and her unwillingness to accept it.
Like that's how she's coping. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not just his fault because she's being gaslit by her parents. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Like she has no validation. So she hasn't had validation from like a trusted adult or trusted person. So she's not ready to accept that, I guess. I think there's a few reasons why she's afraid to accept or fully acknowledge the change that she's seeing. One of them is because it calls into this question of her own identity and who is she if Liz is her. The other, I think, is that she's also legitimately concerned for Liz's health and what it might mean if she's right. This isn't a spoiler, but Alice's denial, I just thought was sort of interesting because way later in the series, XYZ happens, and Alice also is in complete denial, and that's like almost made it's almost thematized, like it's very much presented as such. And so I'm just sort of impressed at how consistent that is. I mean, that's like 100 books later, but she reacts the exact same way. It's really good. Yeah.
It makes sense that in some ways Jessica's acting this way because the people around her are acting this way too. And so we see kind of like that intergenerational transmission of like, this is how we deal with trauma. We pretend it's not real and we yell at people when they bring it up to us.
Elizabeth says she wants to have a party to celebrate her sort of return.
A party would be therapeutic. Jessica says, I love it, Liz. I really love it. We'll invite every terrific guy we know. It'll be great. Now, which girls do we invite, Liz? Lila and Kara Walker, of course. And I suppose you'll want to include Enid Rollins. Why invite any of them, Jess? Can't the Wakefield sisters handle all those guys by themselves? That line is interesting to me for a number of reasons. One, I think it's like just kind of a funny thing. Two is obviously the use of the word handle and the way that we've seen like rape culture throughout the course of this text and all of the text, and like men's desires are something that we handle. The third is the use of themselves and like the depersonalization. I mean, she is one of the Wakefield sisters. So like the natural cadence of that would be, can't the Wakefield sisters handle all those guys by ourselves? Like, can't we do that? But the by themselves, to me, almost feels like it's indicating Elizabeth is still working through who am I, who are you, who are we, who are they.
If she would have said, can't the Wakefield sisters handle all those guys by ourselves? It would conjure the Wakefield sisters, the referent we're all familiar with, the quiet one, the loud one, this one to that one, right? But there's a new Wakefield sisters in town, because the idea that the Wakefield sisters are both engaged in this activity of handling guys forces you to conjure a new image of what you think of your sort of mental referent of the word Wakefield sisters. Now I have to think about two Jessicas. And so I think it's a way of saying what we were is not what we are.
I love that.
On page 28, Jessica is explaining to Todd that Elizabeth says she's too tired to see him. She says she needs as much rest as she can get. And Todd says, then she does remember the accident? Oh, sure, Jessica said, not quite certain if that were true. No one's really sure if she remembers or not. So I think it's important to note that that's actually mentioned, as they don't know.
Yeah.
That means they haven't talked about it, right? This is now weeks after she's recovered.
Of course.
And Jessica doesn't know that. That tells me they're avoiding that topic.
There's also, if we're charting Jessica's empathy journey, Jessica's reflecting and she says, Elizabeth always knew how to break bad news to people without making them feel rotten. That was because she could understand how they were feeling. But I'm not that way, Jessica said to herself. How does she do it?
Yeah, I noted that too. I love it. That's an example of that's a concrete example of breaking bad news to someone and thinking about when you have to give bad news, how to do it in a nice way that thinks about how they're going to feel. She's now working through that. And then she says, but I'm not that way. Well, what we learn in this book is, well, sometimes we're more ways than we thought we are.
Exactly.
Can I do a moment of Jess and Todd? For the first time that afternoon, he smiled. You're right, Jess, I am being a jerk. When Liz gets back to school, everything will be terrific again. I mean, Liz is really something. She's smart, she's hardworking, she's a good writer, she's nice to everybody, and she's beautiful. Something about Todd's weird little monologue about how great Liz is and how perfect and terrific she is was like strange. Like Liz is really like, it just was a weird thing to say. Like when Liz gets back, everything will be terrific. You can see he's convincing himself.
Yes.
I mean, Liz is really something. She's smart, she's hardworking, she's a good writer, she's nice to everybody. He's convincing himself that she's still that Liz, right? Because it's just like, if someone was in a coma and then they were coming back to school and they're your girlfriend, you wouldn't be like, it's gonna be great because like Robert's so great and he's smart and he's nice and everyone likes him and he's good and he's kind and it's like
hardworking.
You're just listing her character traits, trying to like reinforce that she's still that person.
I think there's something really interesting that we see moments throughout the text of different characters distilling down their own or other people's identities. And it's really fascinating how bad everyone is at it. And I think that does make sense because they're all 16. And so they're like still trying on new identities and figuring out who are they? What are the key words that describe them? But it's just so funny that like he distills down her identity to smart, hardworking, good writer, nice to everyone, beautiful. We keep moving. Elizabeth gets ready to go back to school. She looks really terrific. Jessica asks where the outfit came from and says, oh, you can, and Elizabeth says, oh, you can't borrow it. Why in the world would you think? Because I know you, sister dear, Elizabeth answered, grinning, hands off.
Two things. Number one,
at least two.
Sister dear, we already talked about it. I don't need to
Fine.
say that again. But as we've discussed previously, Elizabeth has never set a fucking boundary about Jessica borrowing her clothes. The first time she's been able to say, you cannot borrow this, the first time she's been able to actually set and articulate a boundary is when she's in drag in this new Liz.
I'd also love to just spend a second on because I know you, dear sister. This idea of like, I see who you truly are. I know you.
You know why that actually makes me so mad, Robert?
No.
In the exact moment that Elizabeth is demonstrating the fact that she is evolving and changing, she's saying, but you aren't allowed to.
Right.
I'm allowed to act different than I usually do, but I wouldn't give you that same grace that you could change to return my clothes.
Then Jessica looks at her own reflection in the mirror. The jeans and shirt had looked great 5 minutes ago. Now they looked dull and uninteresting.
Jessica pulled the car into a spot in the student parking lot with her usual flourish. She halfway expected Elizabeth to tell her to stop showing off, but Elizabeth got out of the car without giving the expected lecture on safe driving. Then Enid confuses Jess for Liz.
Can we pause on this moment of Enid confusing Jess and Liz? Because for me, what's interesting about that is Jess hasn't changed.
Exactly.
She's wearing jeans and a shirt. She looks totally Jess normal. And what has changed is Elizabeth. And so what we're seeing here is the idea that Elizabeth's change has put Jess in such a stark contrast that she seems like a Liz compared to the new Liz.
Which is so disturbing. Like for Jess, like I could understand how disorienting and destabilizing that would feel, right? If you're like, I'm me, okay? And like, I haven't changed anything. And this other person who is next to me has changed stuff to where now I am not recognized as myself. I haven't done anything different. Like that's not fair, you know?
Yeah, of course.
Sad. I feel for her. It's frustrating because what it shows is that all these people at school, even their closest friends, like don't see you as a you. They see you as a part of a relation to something else. It's like, that's really a bummer.
It's the dark side of being a twin that I feel like we don't explore as much, is this idea that they don't get their own identity. They're always already compared to one another. We get, of course, it wouldn't be a book without a gross moment between Roger Collins and a young Cohen. So Elizabeth goes into the Oracle office. Roger Collins who, by the way, is a school faculty member, totally different, like should not be interacting with a student in this way, confuses Elizabeth and Jessica. Mr. Collins' jaw dropped slightly. Elizabeth? Elizabeth, she confirmed, dropping gracefully into a chair. Well, maybe a little knock on the head would be good for all of us, he said. You look wonderful, and I'm glad to have you back. We all missed you. Gross.
Disgusting.
Just
Disgusting.
so gross.
Disgusting.
And then she returns, you look pretty good too.
Then he says, being in the hospital must have been a horrible ordeal. Not all of it was bad. She gave him a dazzling, the word usually used to describe Jessica's smile. Fowler Hospital has some fantastic looking doctors and interns. And some of the nurses aren't at all bad, in case you're interested.
For the second time that morning, Mr. Collins' jaw dropped in surprise.
Then she leaves and he says, see you. Welcome back, Elizabeth?
So strange.
He questioned faintly.
But Mr. Collins wasn't the only confused one at Sweet Valley High that day. Other teachers and many of the kids kept mistaking Elizabeth for Jessica. None of this bothered Elizabeth at all, but Jessica was beginning to have an identity crisis.
But I feel like that's the thing that this book is trying to make them realize, which is you've always seen yourselves and structured yourselves and like presented yourselves to the world as these binary of like, there's this one to that one, and this one's this and you're opposites. But guess what, girls? You're not total opposites. And you need to have a more, your identity is not as simple as that. Like Elizabeth,
Right.
you're not just the good, responsible one. You sometimes have other aspects of you, and just, you're not just the fun one. Like you can be nurturing and you have these other things too, right? And you can actually be empathetic, it turns out.
So we get this like segues into the pool party because Jess thinks Liz is upstairs getting ready to help with the pool party, but of course Liz is at the mall. So Jess is left to do all of the errands, all of the prep. Most importantly, she gets out the onion soup mix to make the dip. In my notes, I've just written the word dip, exclamation point with a smiley face. One of my favorite dips is to just take soup mix and sour cream and mix it together. That's an easy recipe for you listeners.
I liked the description of just doing all the prep for the party and waiting for Liz to come help her. Can I just read a bit of it? I don't know why I like this, but like I read it a few times. I don't know. Jessica checked the pool, skimming out leaves and twigs, and made sure the chlorine level was right. She set out the chips and dip and lugged the ice chest filled with soda out onto the patio. Then she moved the stereo speakers. Pausing to look in the mirror, she reacted with horror. Yeah, she gagged, looking at her tangled hair and red, sweaty face. That was the problem with doing all the work. You wound up red-faced, sweaty, cross, and tired. Jessica made one last circuit of the patio, going around the pool to check the little wrought iron tables, and then raced inside to take a shower. I think the reason I found this interesting was a couple of reasons. Like one is, yeah, that is what you would do to have a pool party. Like you would check the chlorine level and you would take other stuff. So I don't know, I just liked reading that. But also I think the line that was the problem with doing all the work. On the previous page, we have Jessica's sort of internal monologue. Actually, that was just the trouble. Normally, it would have been Jess calling from the mall to say she'd be late and Elizabeth going ahead. This was not like Elizabeth. So she's sort of experiencing these feelings of being bothered by what Elizabeth's doing. And she's trying to figure out what it's about. What is the problem here? And she's sort of alternating. So first, she sort of is like, okay, I'm frustrated with the work. Then she says, well, actually, the trouble is this isn't like Elizabeth. What does that imply? Something is seriously wrong with Elizabeth. Okay. Then she tells herself, stop it. You got to make that dip. She keeps doing this work. And then she's frustrated, sweaty faced. That was the problem with doing the work. You wound up red faced, sweaty, cross, and tired. Phew. Right? That's a relief to her. That's the problem. That's why this is frustrating, because now I'm sweaty and tired and I have to rush to do my makeup, not because I need to be seriously worried about my sister.
And again, it's putting within language that she understands, because it's the problem is that physically I am less attractive right now. It is not that I need to grapple with the traumatic brain injury that like is dismantling and destabilizing my life.
But what I think is so like interesting about this is that Jess is telling herself she's more shallow than she is.
Yes.
It's like she's actually worried about Liz's health, but that's scarier. That's too scary to acknowledge. And so she relieves herself by saying, no, that's not why this was nagging at me. It's not because I think there might be something wrong, because she can't handle that and she has no adults to talk to. It's because I'm actually annoyed because I actually look red-faced now, and that's annoying. I'm ready to talk about Alcazar now. The scene with Elizabeth in the shower is so powerful. Jessica's just finished doing all this work. She's waiting for Liz to help her. Hey, she yelled in surprise when she got upstairs. She heard the sound of the shower running. Is that you, Liz? In a minute, she heard floating out from the volcano of steam and froth in the shower. Well, how do you like that? Jessica muttered. Elizabeth had come home, done nothing to help, and sailed into the shower first. Elizabeth Wakefield, you come out of here, Jessica raged. What? Said Elizabeth, turning off the shower, wrapping a towel around herself, then jumping out and smiling radiantly at Jessica. Isn't this going to be a great party? Jessica stood there glaring, but Elizabeth didn't seem to notice. She just skipped past and darted into her room.
Looking back out to say, hey, Jess, you'd better get a move on. You're an absolute mess.
So a few things I got to talk about. Number one is this is the first of several scenes where we're introduced to the new Elizabeth, not by like, Elizabeth did this, and then they saw Elizabeth do that, by hearing, smelling, seeing a flurry of things or people around something or someone, or hearing the laughter first, or hearing the volcano of steam and froth in the shower, and then who could that be is inside. And the same thing happens at the pool party, which I think I want to read the description. But what that does for me is it shows a dissonance where, yeah, of course, if it's not Jess in the shower, it's Liz. Yeah, the person at the pool party is Liz. But because it is so shocking and because it is so uncanny and surreal for Jessica, it's like to describe it in such a way. And then there was a froth, and then all this happened. And then who was the person? It was Elizabeth. I think it's similar to the sort of dissonance of the color and the black and white of the cover of like what she's experiencing is breaking her brain. Yeah. To where she's like, what? Someone's in the shower? Like, is it an intruder? And then the other thing is we get then another couple of examples of her trying to name Liz, trying to call her, and Elizabeth refusing to be interpolated. Okay, so what is interpolation? So Louis Althusser wrote this thing called Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, I think in the 70s, about how societies reproduce class-based hierarchies. And this isn't a Paul Morrison cast, but I don't know if you remember, we did learn about this in our pop culture class with Morrison.
Didn't take it.
Used it. Oh, come on. We sat together in that class. I have the notes that say Robert Marx plus Rebecca Pardo and a heart. Lion King. And so basically what Althusser
of course,
says,
I wrote the Gaze and Gaze paper. Sorry, continue.
So what Althusser says in this is, we tend to think of power as repressive, prohibitive. Power is exerted from without the individual onto them. However, ideological state apparatuses that also use power to construct subjects, it does it with ideology that makes the person believe it is coming from within them, so that they enact that ideology and experience it as the truest expression of their innermost self, Brandeis. So the process of interpolation, which he says is the fundamental act of subject formation, happens in two parts, the hailing and the response. So the hailing is someone from without saying, hey, you there. And the response is saying, yes, it is I. In different ways, there are forces outside of us that are telling us, hey, you there, respond to this thing I call you. And in the moment that you recognize it and you say, yes, it is I, you have become that subject because you are experiencing it as coming within you. That social role has been so completely internalized that it's experienced as the necessary and inherent fulfillment of this unique and individual identity. So when Jess says to Liz in the shower, you know, just like when Liz woke from the coma and Jess said, Liz, and Elizabeth woke and said, Jess. Jess says in the shower, is that you, Liz? Liz doesn't respond, yes. She responds, in a minute. When she's in the house, she says, Liz, you there? No answer. She says, Elizabeth Wakefield's come out of here. Most of this book is Jessica trying unsuccessfully to hail Liz by this old identity and Liz refusing to say it is I. And then at the very, very end, we get her voluntarily when she bonks her head saying, it is I am Liz and that is me.
I think fascinating, awesome, great. I think the part that is doubly interesting because of the twinness of it is the idea that the failed hailing, we'll call it, also puts into question the hailer's identity. So Jessica keeps saying, hey, Liz, and when Liz won't respond to that hailing, it destabilizes who Jessica is as well. And what was happening while I was like trying to give a concrete example of like, okay, what's the hailing? How does that happen in the world outside of this text? And I was thinking, for example, of when I'm teaching and a student's like, hey, teacher. And I say like, yes, it is I. And the way in which that automatically instantiates a teacher-student relationship. Whereas if a student hailed me as like, hey, teacher, And I responded with, in a minute, or what, or any of the ways that Elizabeth responds. It not only destabilizes me as a teacher, but it also kind of removes some of the role or identity of student as the hailer.
100%. And you can see that it makes her increasingly agitated.
Yes.
Yeah. Liz, you there? She called out. No answer.
So then if she can't get an answer from Liz, what does she do? She checks herself out in the mirror. So it's like, okay, you've destabilized. I need to check back in. She examines, literally it is, Liz, you there? No answer. Jessica checked herself out in the mirror, examining her slim, perfectly tanned figure and smashingly daring bikini. She smiled. Not bad, she murmured. The boys of Sweet Valley wouldn't have a chance that night. And
so what she's anticipating and looking forward to is going out to the pool party and being able to garner attention. By the time she came downstairs, the gang was already starting to arrive. A bunch of people are gathered around the pool. They were all standing around somebody near the diving board, somebody who had their undivided attention. Jessica heard a provocative, flirtatious laugh rise from the circle of boys. That's my laugh, she whispered, confused. But it was Elizabeth doing the laughing. And then she talks about her sexy bikini Elizabeth's wearing, but it was something in the way Elizabeth moved among the odd guys. She was holding a platter of chips and dip, and as she turned between Ken Matthews and John Pfeiffer, she treated them each to dazzling smiles. Jessica's social role is entertaining. Jessica's job is to make the party be fun. Elizabeth is doing that. Where does that leave her?
And it actually leaves her talking to Todd. Todd says, I guess she's feeling better. If she felt any better, she'd be orbiting the moon. Remember Jessica. But Jessica couldn't really complain. She was glad to see Elizabeth enjoying herself so much. The party was a blazing success, largely because of Elizabeth's radiant performance. She picked out the music, insisted on dancing with every boy, and kept up a nonstop chatter that the guys found fascinating. I haven't read a lot of these books, but that is how we describe Jessica, not how we describe Liz. Jessica couldn't really complain. She was glad to see Elizabeth enjoying herself so much, which kind of speaks to this kind of weird place that Jessica finds herself. She is frustrated. She is losing her own identity. And yet she thought Elizabeth was dead. So this is better than that. And so she has to kind of grin and bear it.
And on the face of it, what is she complaining about? Oh, Elizabeth's having fun. And so because, again, she has no trusted adult, her complaints, or her even just describing the changes she's seeing would sound like jealousy or envy. And that's what her parents actually think. Her parents actually later come talk to her and she's like, finally, they're aware of this and finally they've noticed and I'm going to have some support in this. And they come talk to her and they're like, so you're jealous that she's getting so much attention, right? It's like, no one sees her.
Yeah.
One thing I thought was kind of a nice little touch was Jessica and Todd stood by the patio doors, drinking sodas and watching the new firefly of the Wakefield family. A firefly emits light to attract mates. The new firefly of the Wakefield family sort of reminds me of can't the Wakefield sisters handle themselves? There has been a structural change in the Wakefield family where the Wakefield twins used to look like this. Now there's a new firefly of the Wakefield family. It sort of implies can there be two?
Right.
And then Sarah says to Jessica, would you check out Miss Butterfly of the Year? And Jessica snaps, what kind of crack is that? And I was thinking a little bit about the difference between butterfly and firefly. I think butterfly, it's beautiful. It also it's transformation. It was something, now it's something else, and that's permanent, and that's what it is now. And that's maybe what Jessica's responding to. I'm sure you had feelings about the moment where Winston comes up to Jessica at the pool party, and Jessica suddenly looks at him with a different perspective.
Of course. She felt a curious twinge of jealousy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jessica's jealous, not because Winston's paying attention to Elizabeth. He's not paying attention to Elizabeth. He's paying attention to his new girlfriend, Mandy. But everyone else is paying attention to Elizabeth. And Winston's attentions is something that Jessica used to be able to count on. And She's sort of realizing now, I think, that she took it for granted in a way, the sort of validation that she was used to getting from Winston. And I think it's sort of interesting that she then calls him Win. He asks her for more soda, and typically Jess would probably say some snide remark to him, but she's like, hang in there, I'll go get it for you. And she calls him Win, affectionate. So I thought
he's growing a little. We talked a little bit about the ghostly echoes from book 1. I'm sure you highlighted Elizabeth talking to Ken Matthews.
There's the resonance to Jessica being an NBA recruiter.
Yes.
And Elizabeth trying to be a football recruiter. Okay.
Let me just quote. I was just telling my father the other day, Ken Matthews knows all there is to know about football. Well, Ken blushed. Oh, yes, you do, Ken. Why, I bet we'll see you out there playing with the Rams in a few years. Elizabeth is taking up Jess's mantle as a recruiter for professional sports. This, of course, for the NFL Rams.
And then also, of course, last book, Elizabeth gave Ken a squeeze on the shoulder, called him an angel for the simple fact of she was looking for Todd, said, has anyone seen him? And Ken said, yeah, he's in the parking lot. Elizabeth squeezed his shoulder, said, you're an angel. So I'm just saying, we have a thread now.
We definitely have a thread. Things began adding up in a way Jessica didn't like, but there it was. Elizabeth had conveniently gone shopping at the mall instead of being home to help with the party preparations. Not only had she gotten out of setting up for the party, but she'd also sneaked home and into the shower right under her sister's nose. And finally, there was Elizabeth, looking sensational, flirting madly with every guy at the party. Why, she's doing at least 137 things that I usually do, Jessica raged inwardly. At least things I sometimes do, once in a while.
It's showing us, I think, that some of her challenge with recognizing her frustration with new Liz is that entails recognizing that she often behaves badly and that makes other people feel that way. And then she has Kara come and tell her the butterfly comment, and Jessica says, oh, she's not a flirt or whatever. And Kara's like, well, I just never seen Liz do that. Usually you do that. And Jess says she's exactly the same. Kara Walker had unwittingly suggested what was bothering Jessica most. She'd been circling around it all evening, feeling it, but unwilling to say it or even think it. Elizabeth had somehow turned into her, Jessica. She was even out Jessica-ing her. It couldn't happen. It must not be allowed to happen. If she's Jessica, she agonized, then who am I? I was so disturbed by, after the party, Jess is like, Liz, I want to talk to you, which is probably the most mature way Jessica's ever started a conversation. Like, she's actually being like calm. She's being direct. She's preparing her for it. This may be something. And Liz basically feigns a headache.
I love it.
And Jess is concerned because of this. And then at the next moment, Elizabeth shot up the stairs 2 at a time. It wasn't until she was almost finished that Jessica realized she had done all the work for the party. She'd set up, dashed around like a servant all evening, and then cleaned everything afterward. Stop it, she told herself. Elizabeth would have done the same thing for her. She was just tired. Sure, said another inner voice. She was really a decrepit wreck when she hopped up the stairs like a little rabbit about 2 seconds after saying she had a splitting headache. Jessica understood these tricks well enough because she used them, every one of them, time and again on her sister. And then she froze. The same frightening sensation swept through her. Is it possible? Has Elizabeth turned into me? I don't know. I just found it so upsetting and I know it's like Elizabeth's giving her just desserts and this is what Jessica always does. But Jessica is so concerned for her health and for Liz to exploit that. Just so rude.
I loved it. I thought it was hilarious. And I wrote down, claiming a headache to get out of a tough talk. I love it.
Can I get to the Frankenstein comment? Or
Thank you.
So Elizabeth comes and snaps at her again and says she's sick of hanging out with dull people and now she's going to live life in the fast lane. Then she leaves the room. Did you hear that, Dr. Frankenstein? Jessica muttered. You're not the only one who created a monster. Jessica created a monster in 2 ways, potentially, right? And again, it's this question of like, who is responsible for what? The ways in which she could be considered as having created a monster, number 1 is in her behavior for the past 16 years, creating a model for Elizabeth to now imitate. And then number 2, the question of created that monster, like, would that have happened if she would have gone and picked Elizabeth up and there would have never been an accident? And did she create the monster in the way that she played some role in the accident?
It's actually a very nuanced reading of Frankenstein. As someone who has taught Frankenstein to 16-year-old students, like, they often don't understand the ways in which Dr. Frankenstein is actually monstrous. Like, they focus on he sewed the body parts together and that's how he created a monster. But like, one of the other things we think about is like, he actually created the monster by not treating him with love and kindness, by modeling bad behavior, by avoiding him, etc.
The fact that Jessica wouldn't have that misunderstanding that is so ubiquitous in the culture of Frankenstein's the monster. This is better literature. This is better than Frankenstein.
It's better than Frankenstein, absolutely.
Okay, then we are introduced to the Percys. And this is an insane storyline. Ned Wakefield drops a bombshell. The Percys are going to be in Europe for a few weeks for some kind of computer conference, and we're going to have some house guests.
Huh?
The Percys, Jessica frowned. Weren't they the ones with the Percys' 12-year-old twins are going to stay with us while their parents are away? Won't that be fun? As you would say, My questions are numerous.
I would
Number
say that.
one, what kind of computer conference lasts a few weeks?
Yeah.
Number two, a few weeks of childcare for two 12-year-old girls should not happen with people that are so unfamiliar to them that Jessica is sort of only vaguely knows who they are. For two girls to stay at their house for 3 weeks, they should be like legit family friends, if not family. You know what I'm saying? And so the fact that Jessica is only barely peripherally remembering who these people are makes me even more like, this is not appropriate.
Can I tell you the story I tell myself a little bit, which is kind of in the words of you? So I have this backstory where Ned and Alice belong to a support group for parents of twins. Because in the world of Sweet Valley, having twins is so bizarre that no one can make sense of it and no one understands it. So
who knows if the Percys even live in Sweet Valley? They could have drove in from Santa Barbara or some neighboring town just to connect with twin parents. You're right. Sure, I still hated it. Just like Elizabeth is just out of a coma. Like Ned and Alice, they need to pay more attention to like making sure things are functional in their own home.
Our twins, our beloved twins, are talking about how crappy it's going to be to hang out with the Percy twins. Liz is the one who complains a broken leg would be more fun than babysitting those two little twerps. Jess jumps in. Hey, Liz, it won't be so bad. Like having kid sisters in a way, we'll let them do all our chores. Jessica, kidding, Mom. Just kidding, honest. That's my girl, Ned Wakefield beamed.
Okay, I have stated before that I believe Jessica has a father wound. She has a wound that involves not being seen and approved by Ned. In this book, there are multiple examples of Ned beaming with pride, patting her on the back, talking about how she's grown and she's become more responsible. And there's a line later somewhere where she basks in the glow of his approval or something. There's a few made of this. I believe Liz has more a mother wound. And in previous books, there's been talk of whenever Jessica's getting into some scheme, Liz is, oh, but won't mom notice? Won't mom notice? Or when Elizabeth was like, how come mom didn't notice that thing? It's like, oh, I guess because she was just worried about her project. Liz is always looking for attention from the mom. Jessica's looking for attention from the dad. And in this book, we get a lot of her getting a chance to experience that approval from him.
The Percy twins come over half an hour later.
Yeah, they have no time to prepare. They tell them last minute. They're crazy. I hate the fucking Wakefields. There's something else around like fractal recursion or the like relative structuring of stuff where like when Jess says, hey, Liz, it won't be so bad. Like having kid sisters, we'll let them do our chores. It's like, now that we're both Jesses, we can make them our Liz.
Exactly. And then we meet the Percy twins. The twins were fragile, dark-haired girls with large brown eyes set in small, solemn faces. They were wearing identical gray jumpers and long-sleeved white blouses, and they were clutching identical black flute cases. What's going on here with this description of these twins?
Like, I feel like the Percy twins represent like where Elizabeth and Jess started. When they were children, like as we see in Sweet Valley, like Sweet Valley Twins starts out with like, they used to dress alike, right?
Yeah.
And twins comes after this. But when they're 12, it's like they literally are finding their own identities. And that's that trajectory, right? And so I think it represents that version of them, that version of twins when they were completely co-identified to where you can't even tell them apart, right? And that's a problem. And that's something Jess and Liz have grown away from, right? And now everyone can tell them apart till recently. But the problem is what Jessica, I think, is now realizing is being opposites isn't working either.
Right.
Or part of hers, right? And so it's like, is there an alternative to the extreme stereotype of Jess and Liz difference or the like identical, you completely can't tell a difference? And now they are going back to the identical, you can't tell a difference because everyone's confusing Liz for her. So where does that leave her? So I think it's some sort of foil, some sort of seeing themselves through them.
There's something with the shadow selves of them being fragile, dark-haired girls with large brown eyes. Like in some ways, they're the inversions of Liz and Jess, I feel like.
Yes, right. They don't have California tans. Again,
Could
they
you imagine?
drove from across the country. They almost remind me of like the Shining twins in the sense of like they seem sort of creepy and out of time. They seem like they're wearing old-fashioned clothing, like identical gray jumpers, long sleeve white blouses, clutching black flute cases and having big eyes and small faces. That's a horror movie.
Yeah.
A line that I thought was really funny was Jessica took one look at them and decided to move to San Francisco at the earliest possible moment. I love her.
I love her.
As soon as the twins are settled into Stephen's room, Ned and Alice Wakefield left for an evening of bridge. Ned and Alice Wakefield need someone to dump a pail of water on their head. Okay? Not only did they take on this thing of having these two kids in their house after their daughters had just gone through an extremely traumatic event that hasn't been at all addressed, with no warning or preparation. They get there and the Wakefield's just leave and say, deal with it? The fuck is wrong with them?
This is not how you parent, my friends.
Something that I think is really interesting is that this book sees Jessica giving Danny Stouffer another chance. And I think that coincides. No, I love it. It's good, right? Because listen, this is part of her growth. She previously rejected Danny Stouffer for the sole reason that he didn't fight back against Crunch McAllister, right? Now that she is having some sort of growth, something has led her to give Danny Stouffer a second chance. I just think that's interesting because he was the first guy who was actually seemed kind of nice. But then, of course, I think what's really a bummer about this is that later in the book, he doesn't attack her. He's not violent. There's nothing like that. But pretty much as soon as he doesn't get instantly laid, he ditches her for someone else. And so, again, my heart breaks for Jessica because she decided to give this supposed nice guy a chance. But even the nice guy sucks.
So Jessica's giving Danny Stouffer another chance.
Did I tell you about my absolutely sensational plans for tonight? I'm giving Danny Stouffer a second chance. He's taking me to the drive-in.
Oh, what's playing?
Who cares? Did I ever tell you about the front seat in Danny's car? It slides back and reclines, and I probably don't have to draw you a picture, do I?
No, Jess. Pictures aren't necessary. Have fun. That feels like an exaggeration of even Jessica to me. Like the idea of talking about it reclining all the way, I don't have to draw you a picture. Like it almost feels like she's doing Jessica drag at this point. Like she's exaggerating to be like, okay, well, if you're going to take it to 7, I'm going to bump it to 11.
She's trying to prove that she's still her. So what happens is Jessica tells Liz that she has this date with Danny she's excited about. She hasn't really been out since the whole thing with Liz. She's looking forward to this. Liz knows it, blah, blah, blah. Liz then gets dressed up to go out and tells the Percy twins to let Jessica know that she's going to be watching them that night. And so the Percy twins tell Jessica what happened. And basically Jessica realizes she has to bring them with her to the drive-in. And then she basically tells Danny, like, I'm so sorry. And he's like, well, that's not what I had in mind. And she basically like says, like, I'll do anything to make it up to you. And it says, like, she knew she was getting in too deep, but she couldn't help herself. And that made me so sad because it's like, she's like promising Danny sexual favors. So again, there is this sort of like coercive element potentially with him. And it's like, she doesn't want to do it, but she can't help herself. And I think it has to do with her proving to herself she's still Jess.
Yeah.
All right. Milk count. Chapter 7. We got our first milk.
We got our first milk and we've got, of course, our
Juice.
second orange juice.
Both the juice and the milk are placed on the table, but only the juice is picked up. So we don't actually see anyone ingest milk.
Yeah. We see Alice just being a terrible mom. She says, I've been wanting to talk to you about Elizabeth. Before you say a word, honey, I want you to know your father and I are aware of what you're going through. We've been paying a lot more attention to Elizabeth than to you lately, but I don't want you to think we don't love you every bit as much. Mom, I know. Let me finish. I don't want you to resent your sister because of that extra attention. So we see here that like Alice is just truly in left field and has no read either on the situation with Elizabeth or the situation with Jessica.
And she refuses to ask. Like she never once just says to Jess, like, how are you?
Right.
How are you feeling? She just tells her how she's feeling and refuses to listen.
We go to school and we see this moment as we're charting Jessica's empathy journey.
Yeah.
As Jessica feels sympathy for Enid and the way that Elizabeth has left Enid in the dust. And so Jessica even invites her to the Dairy Burger after school.
Jessica couldn't understand why she had invited her. She certainly didn't care about Enid Rollins' feelings, did she?
Like, this is a moment where Jess is like exploring her own identity too. And she's like, wait, am I a nice person?
And then we get to the freaking plagiarism.
Oh, gosh.
Okay. Liz, being manipulative, tells Wynn that she's so worried of catching up with her work and she has to write this paper. And she's like, oh, didn't you get a good grade on it? He's like, yeah. She's like, oh, well, could I take a look? And he's like, I guess you could look at some of the references. Maybe that'll give you a start. She's like, oh, yeah, okay. And she just takes it and hands it in.
What's that paper on, Parda?
I forget.
It's on the Punic Wars.
What's that?
Which were a series of wars between Rome and Carthage. Carthage was a dominant force at the time. And Rome rose up and took control and often used many of Carthage's tactics that had been so successful in Carthage in the past to neutralize Carthage. So Rome made it impossible for Carthage to use their usual tricks because Rome was using their usual tricks. I think we see the resonances here with Elizabeth's rise over Jessica and the ways in which there are lots of
I think our readers can connect the dots there.
Absolutely.
No, but I like that. I like that.
Okay, thank you. Now, Collins introduces a phrase that I absolutely could neither make heads nor tails of, nor could Google to satisfaction.
I lost my freaking applesauce over it when I saw it.
Elizabeth, I hope you know that I'm a friend, not only a teacher and an advisor. And friends don't dish out a lot of applesauce to each other. Now what have I done? Elizabeth asked, sounding hurt. So Elizabeth knows what it means to dish out a lot of applesauce to each other.
Yeah, and then later he's like, thought we weren't dishing applesauce to each other, Liz.
And it's like, what do you even mean by this? This is not a phrase.
Well, I was able to deduce that it means telling bullshit.
But it's just like, that's not it. Are you trying to start this, Roger Collins? Like, just because you're a dreamy teacher does not mean that you're going to set youth slang.
So yes, she plagiarized a paper. That's one thing she did. Another thing she did was, after Jess told her while she was supposedly still in her coma that she's always nice in eyes and ears, she, for the first time in history, does a vindictive eyes and ears about basically implying that Susan Stewart, Ken Matthews' girlfriend, is cheating on him. And Collins catches her and he asks her, what happened? And she says, why should everybody else have fun because of my column and not me? Then it's true. Well, I wrote the item. I really can't help it if Ken Matthews likes me, can I? That's not the point, Elizabeth, and you know it. It's about something called ethics, something called integrity. You used to understand those words. Not only did you write a self-serving item, but it's not even true.
Meanwhile, Todd is playing basketball. He's the big basketball star. Elizabeth shows up with Ken Matthews. Todd is playing terrible basketball. Then we get the coach, who is a father figure, talking through the problem, what's going on with Todd. Coach Horner is the first one who's like, hey, something's going on. Why is no one talking about these kids? And I love
it.
He validates it. The other thing I love about Coach Horner, he is like the anti-Collins. This idea that Coach Horner is validating the pain and trauma, but also is like not up all in their grill. He doesn't know who Elizabeth is. He's not like, oh, the beautiful blonde twin. He is just a normal adult who says like, hey, what's going on? And I really like that.
So yeah, he's telling Todd, like, is there something going on with their girlfriend? He goes, from what I hear, Elizabeth's a fine girl, but I think she has problems right now. Todd says, you think so? Yes, you acted very out of character, and that's why I knew something was very wrong. If that girl is acting out of character, there's something wrong there too. And then Todd feels relief.
And then Elizabeth gets busted about the term paper. And
yeah, and then Jessica gets punished by the Wakefields of like, Jessica, you must have known this was going on.
Jessica, why didn't you tell us what was going on? You must have known. And then we get perhaps the most shocking moment of this whole text.
Shocking for me too, and I've read it 137 million times.
My jaw dropped. The end of Jessica's sentence was drowned out by the roar of an approaching motorcycle. Jessica and Todd turned and saw a bike with two riders coming at them fast. They stood there amazed as Elizabeth zoomed up the Wakefield's driveway and screeched to a halt. She whipped off her helmet, allowing her long blonde hair to fall in graceful waves around her face. How did I do, Max? Elizabeth asked as she turned to grin at her passenger, Max Dellon, lead guitarist of Sweet Valley High's favorite rock band, The Droids. You definitely are something else, Liz, like wild, you know?
And then like Elizabeth leaves and gets back on the bike and Jess again says, Elizabeth Wakefield, what do you think you're doing? Again, trying to interpolate her, trying to hail her.
Sure.
And Elizabeth refuses to respond to the call. Meanwhile, the Percy twins have to go to their flute audition and Alice and Ned can't do it. So they decide Jess is going to do it.
She is shepherding these younger twins. She is serving in the role of a mother. At one point, they say, oh, won't you come in with us? And she says, no, why would I come in with you? And they say, but mom always came in. And so we see this young girl, this young woman, being forced into a role that is not appropriate to her.
When they say mom always comes in, she says, I'm not your mother. They say, but you're kind of like a big sister, aren't you, Jessica? I think the word big sister is important because Elizabeth famously is the big sister of Jess by 4 minutes. And Jess
Famously.
often teasingly calls Elizabeth big sister for that reason. But the same way Elizabeth has often looked out for Jessica and been responsible for her, Jessica is being the big sister and being the sort of Elizabeth to these girls. She's speeding because the audition has taken so long, but her date with Danny has gotten delayed. And after the drive-in scenario, she knows that he's waiting to get those sexual favors. So she's trying to get to the beach to see him. She gets a speeding ticket and they finally get there. And the twins point out that he's with another pretty girl in a white bikini.
Did you notice that in these 2 chapters, everyone calls Jessica Miss?
No?
License and registration, Miss.
Right.
I beg your
right.
pardon, Miss.
Right.
Go
Yeah,
on.
the same way that like everyone at school started treating her like Elizabeth, even these random like these other adults that she's just encountering these random situations because she's in the Elizabeth role of being the responsible one. She's driving around kids, she's taking them to the thing. It's like they treat her like she's a responsible adult. Yeah.
Exactly.
One detail I noticed about Jess at the audition and then at the fender bender is those were 2 times that she tried to use her winning smile to get out of situations and it didn't work. So when she was at the audition, she smiled at the person thinking she'll get ahead in line and they ended up having to wait anyway. And in the fender bender, she tried to smile and charm her way out of it and she couldn't. So I think that's, so this is like,
Yeah.
she's now totally. Todd and Jessica find out that Liz and Bruce have been seen together. They're worried about her. They go to follow her. Elizabeth is in Bruce's sleek black Porsche.
They're kissing a lot.
Oh wait, did he already give her booze?
He's given her a little and he wants to give her more.
Right, he gave her a little out of he gave her a little booze out of a flask, and then she says she wants some wine. It makes me feel so good. And he calls her Sweet Liz and says, I have more. And she says, ooh, I like that. Sweet Liz, that's me. She's giggling, and I like whatever it is you're doing to my neck.
And then, of course, Todd interrupts, punches Bruce out cold, and then Todd takes Elizabeth home. Yeah, I just want to say, so chapter 13 starts with, stay right where you are, young lady. And I think I, as a reader, expected that this was Alice lecturing Elizabeth about everything Elizabeth has done wrong.
Such a fucking great point, Robert, because the parents never scold her.
No.
It's so unfair.
Yes.
They're scolding Jessica for the speeding ticket, okay?
And for the fender bender. And then one of the strangest things happens, and I love it.
Me too.
The twins, and by the twins, I mean the Percy twins, Jean and Joan, come through in a big way. They say, could we talk to you for a minute? And then the parents are like, okay, come in, girls. You were with Jessica that day. Maybe you can tell us what happened. Jessica couldn't have been going as fast as that policeman said she was, Jean stated. It's not possible. Mr. Wakefield smiled condescendingly at them. I know you want to help Jess, but she was tracked by radar. She was doing 70. She couldn't have been, Mr. Wakefield. Those radar guns sometimes make mistakes. My dad told me that once a big old oak tree was clocked at 40 miles an hour. And besides that, Joan put in, I always get car sick at high speeds, and I felt just fine that day.
I just want to note that the reinforcing of dad knowledge, as my dad told me that once. So of course, this is going to convince Ned,
And about that dent, Joan continued, Jessica started backing out first. That man in the other car was more to blame than she was. It looks like you have a couple of pretty good defense attorneys, Ned Wakefield said, smiling. What do you think, Alice? I think you and I might have overreacted, Ned. Perhaps this was a case of carelessness, not recklessness. But don't think you're off the hook entirely, young lady. There will be a punishment. Your father and I will discuss this further and talk to you about it later. These parents do not know anything about parenting.
They don't listen. They listen more to these 2 children that they barely know. And they're like, oh, okay, I guess we overreacted, without ever asking Jessica for her perspective on what happened or her story.
It's wild. They say, oh, twins, you were there with Jessica. You'll be able to tell us what happens. Jessica could tell you what happens. These girls are 12. Like, what is going on, parents?
Then Jessica has a moment with the twins and they apologize for making trouble for her with the drive-in and messing up her date and the audition with Danny. And Jessica apologizes for yelling at them. They say, that was nothing. Our flute teacher always yells at us. And besides, we had so much fun with you going to a drive-in. No one ever takes this place like that. It was actually so cool. them doing that for her, and then the conversation they have afterwards, I think is also a way of like showing Jessica that when she does be a little bit reliable or care for others, even in small ways, can make a big difference to other people.
Yeah.
Because the fact that she literally just took them to their audition, right? She just drove them there and sat there while they did it, meant enough to them for them to go out of their way. It pays to be nice, like not in just a selfish way, but like doing things for people changes like the experience they have, and it changes how they see you, and like everyone's life could be better if you're nice to people.
Yeah. Then Liz runs into Bill Chase. Elizabeth turned around and saw Bill Chase coming down the corridor towards her. He was wearing his usual land outfit of jeans and a t-shirt. Land outfit. Like,
So good.
Clothes. They're clothing. Everyone is wearing jeans and a t-shirt all the time. His usual land outfit. I love it.
No, but that's funny. It's funny.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, yeah, his long, straight blonde hair was dry for a change, and he was carrying books instead of a surfboard. So then Liz makes a date with Bill.
So then she makes plans with Bruce instead. And then this very weird thing happens. We cut to Saturday night. Bill shows up at the house. He sees and correctly identifies Jess and says, "Hi, Jess, I'm here to pick up Liz. Is she ready?" But of course, Liz has already left. Jess realizes Liz is on another date. And so she goes, "Why should Liz have all the fun?" And she transforms herself into Liz to go on a date with Bill.
Now we got Elizabeth back with Bruce at the Patman's beach house. They are having a long, probing kiss. She breaks free of him, protesting laughingly. This starts chapter 14. He says, "What's the matter? I thought you liked me. You certainly liked me the other night." His face is flushed with anger. He doesn't want her to play hard to get. And now we have Elizabeth in this very familiar scene that we're used to seeing Jessica in, where she's sort of flirting. He's accusing her of teasing. She's trying to sort of manage it.
He says he thinks never had a conquest seem so important to him. He says, "You want to say yes, I know you do."
He let one hand slide lightly onto her breast.
Oh, God. Okay.
Waiting to see if she would protest. "That feels so good, Bruce," Elizabeth sighed. And I just want to say it feels good to her. And I just think it's worth noting is that like part of this she's enjoying.
But I do want to say like, this is not a model for healthy relationships. He touches her waiting to see if she would protest.
100%. The reason I'm just pointing out that she is enjoying part of it is because like similarly to what we said in the past about how it's a bummer that Jessica has no safe options to explore her sexuality with. Elizabeth likes part of this, and unfortunately, there is no way to engage in that without dealing with violence in these scenarios. It sucks. I will say, like as a child, this was one of the most titillating sentences I'd ever read. To see it, I mean, I'm reading this as a between 8 and 12 year old.
Like a Percy twin.
Okay. To see that not only are they drinking, he puts his hand on her breast. Like it was just like so transgressive or something. Like a hand on a breast. Like I never heard such a thing, a hand on a breast. It's like am I really reading this? Like it felt so like, oh, I'm really reading something like extremely sexy that I really don't normally get to see is like the word breast.
A, that's awesome, and I love that, and I love the exploration of young partosexuality. But B,
but it's like so fucked up because
that's what's insidious and gross about this is that while you're being titillated, you're also Elizabeth couldn't see his triumphant smile and didn't know how he planned to gloat about his victory over the girl who had always snubbed him.
I just feel like as a child, I internalized that message of like the intermingling of like sexual pleasure and like either like a punishment or nefariousness or like the other shoe hasn't dropped. Like you can't just enjoy someone touching your breast without there being something fundamentally wrong in the situation. Like your brain is broken or like you then have to suffer violence or it's danger.
It's danger. I'm moving on to Jessica and Bill. Because we cut between Bruce and Liz's date and Jess and Bill's date. Basically, the whole point of that is that they're just like having a nice time, but Jessica is pretending to be Liz. She's like kind of teasing Bill and being like, "You love my sister. I think you really like her, blah, blah, blah."
We know Jessica holds a grudge, okay? And the same way Enid preferred Elizabeth's company to her, and Jessica never forgot that. She once asked Bill to a Sadie Hawkins party, and he said no, and has had a crush on Elizabeth instead. And this has burned Jessica so badly. But I do think it's sort of worth working out, like, what exactly is going on here. It's like she has to be Elizabeth to secure the time with him, but if she has the time with him, he'll actually be attracted to her to kiss her, and that means he likes Jessica because the physical kiss is the real her. It's like, what's going on there?
It's very confusing. I assume it will be unpacked a little more in book 8, Heartbreaker, not to spoil the cliffhanger. We cut back to Elizabeth in bed. Bruce has left her for a second. She got up from the bed and was groping through the darkness of the room for the door when she bumped against a chair. She fell to the floor, slamming her head against a heavy wooden table. Elizabeth lay on the floor stunned, strange lights and noises whirring through her head. She was in a dark room somewhere. What is this place? How did I get here? Did I buy a bigger bed? Where am I?
She was still in the hospital, she decided, but that wasn't right either. So based on that,
yes,
are we meant to believe she has I think we're meant to believe she has no memory since the hospital?
But she has memory of the hospital.
Which doesn't make sense. It is worth saying that, like, what happens here is fucking crazy, which is that she first had a maybe not brain injury that led to this personality change. And then the hitting of the head did something to sort of reverse that, which I have never heard of.
No, it's not. It's a soap opera. It's not real, but that's okay.
But I think it's important because the bonking of the head, making it go back and her supposedly forgetting things, implies that, like, she wasn't consciously doing that.
Yes,
like, it was her brain doing that, right? Which I think is up for question. But
yeah, I think what's so confusing or interesting or rich about this text is that it simultaneously sets up two contradictory explanations that have tons and tons of support. One is Elizabeth has agency and is acting in this way as a means of processing everything that happened. And the other is, no, this was all like a weird neurological glitch, and she bangs her head and is back to normal.
And maybe it's like both or in between or something like that. Like, maybe it's like, because the brain does things when one does not want to cope. And so there is something in between, sort of like a to B sort of neurological causal thing, and like a thing your brain is doing that you don't realize that you're not controlling, but is being caused by your ability to handle your emotions. And I think with Elizabeth, it's all of those possibilities are true, right? It's like, is it the traumatic brain injury making her act different? Maybe. Is it the traumatic brain injury experience leading her to have motivations for however consciously or unconsciously acting different? Is it somewhere in between? What does it mean? What is the real Liz? What is the old Liz? What is the new Liz? Like, because your experience also impacts your personality.
To finish, we should probably just finish the book because we're basically there. She's like, why is Bruce around? Get away from me.
She says, let me out. Oh, no, you don't. You're going to give me what I want, what you promised.
Roughly, he seized her wrist and she was helpless.
And then she bites his lip to get away. It gives her a minute to get out. She calls him a coward. She runs outside. She kept running until she felt sand beneath her feet. It was wonderful to know who she was and where she was again. She ends up getting into Todd's arms. Oh, Todd, I've never been so glad to see anybody. Todd was startled. What's going on? Help me. And then he looks into her beautiful sea-colored eyes, and they were the ones he loved. The tear-stained face was the one he knew. It's you, Liz, he cried. It's really you. He pulled her into the warm safety of his arms. Oh, Todd, I don't understand what's happened. It's all right, Liz. Everything's all right. You don't have anything to worry about now. You're safe, Liz. You're safe. You haven't been yourself for so long. You are back to being Elizabeth, aren't you? Todd, of course. Who else would I be? This is the moment of interpolation. This is the moment where she responds to the hailing. It's like by not being Elizabeth, it's like she upended the order of the universe or something. Like, everything went cuckoo, topsy-turvy, you know?
As she runs outside, a brilliant moon sailed through the dark sky, and she wanted to yell, "Hi there, you old moon." She wanted to thank the stars for still shining. The sound of the surf crashing on the beach was a symphony. You're right, there's this return to nature. Nature is healing. They then realize, Todd goes, wait, if you're here, who was with Bill Chase on the beach? And then they both realize it's Jessica.
Okay, Bill's with Jessica on the beach. Jessica says, look at me and tell me again.
I love you.
And not my sister?
No, never. I couldn't possibly love anyone but you. I've never been surer of anything in my life.
Then you do love Jessica Wakefield, Bill, because that's who I am.
It ends, listeners, with, is Bill Chase caught in Jessica's trap? Find out in Sweet Valley High number 8, Heartbreaker. So I kind of thought that like weird ambiguity of like, what is she doing? Is she interested in him? Is she just fucking with him? I thought was like, keep reading to figure this out. It's supposed to be confusing. We'll puzzle that out together in Heartbreaker. Just rest assured that like Liz is back to Liz and Jess is back to Jess and the moon is in the sky and the natural order has been restored.
Thanks for listening to Sweet Valley Hive, hosted by Robert Marks and Rebecca Pardo. For more, check out our Instagram at Sweet Valley Hive. Theme song by Yessie and artwork by Elliot Carroll.